Oh, hello my friends, hope you are well. In my last video I made a grot tank from scratch and it looked pretty good in the end, so I thought to myself, what other expensive and rarely available Forge World miniatures could I recreate? Today I'm putting that idea to the test and trying my hand at recreating a spooky old Mourngul. Let's get into it.
Swamp Rat Miniatures.
Now, the first thing I needed to do for this ghouly boy was create a kind of skeleton that I could build the rest of our miniature around later. So, after attaching some XPS foam to a 60mm base for our foundation, I cut and bent some steel wire into a shape resembling the silhouette of the Mourngul's outstretched arms. Then, with a healthy serving of hot glue, our wire shape was secured into place. I'm not sure if the Forge World kit itself included a horse, but a lot of the images I was seeing of Mournguls contained an unlucky little equine caught in his loving embrace, and I wanted to add one too. Luckily, one of my old Rohirrim warriors had a spare horse I could sacrifice for the cause, and the only thing was these little Middle-earth miniatures are slightly smaller scale than Warhammer, so we'll have to pretend this is maybe a little baby horse or something instead, which is kind of more sad I suppose, but you know, maybe it will get away. I mean, it won't, but you never know. Anyway, I bent up some pieces of floral wire into rough hand shapes with 5 fingers on one of them as usual and 4 fingers on this other one, so I could use this piece of wire going into the base as the missing 5th digit. These are attached with some more hot glue, and then I add a whole bunch of the floral wire around the centre of the torso here to start adding a bit of bulk and structure. I also attached this random plastic nodule to act as the head later, and our little guy was now reminding me of a creepy version of the Pixar lamp for some reason. Next up, I give the entire skeleton a thin coating using more hot glue, and if you've seen a few of my videos, you've probably seen me use this method to build a bunch of other things. I just think it's a really quick and easy way to bulk out any shapes you're building, so I highly recommend it. But yeah, I'm being careful here not to go too over the top, as I still need to add green stuff later, and I don't want him looking too thick. I trimmed the head-shaped nodule down using a sharp knife as it was looking a bit too large, and then I built up a foundation for the Mourngul's pretty terrifying mouth using a bit more floral wire and hot glue. Finally, with a touch more hot glue onto the upper back and shoulders to give him more of a hunched and menacing appearance, our basic building work was now finished. And actually, I have to say I was really pleased with how he was looking at this point. He's definitely on the right track, so I was feeling pretty good about this all, and I was actually feeling quite confident about pulling this off, although that confidence didn't last very long. The next step in the building process for our handsome little man was to cover the entire miniature in an initial layer of green stuff. This would add some rigidity to the miniature and give me a firm surface to start building up some details. I made a start on the mouth first, as this section was going to need a bit of extra attention, so after adding a nice little green stuffed sausage for the gums, I stuck in a bunch of these floral wire offcuts to act as anchors for the teeth. The Mourngul has some pretty intimidating gnashes on him, and the thought of trying to raw dog in a bunch of tiny little green stuffed teeth sounded like a pain in the ass to be honest, but adding these wires really mitigated that, as it made it really simple to attach the teeth later on. I added a bit of texture inside the mouth, and once that was all looking decent, I began building up the lips on the outside of the mouth. I used some more skinny sausages of green stuff for this, sticking them down and then smoothing them over with a sculpting tool, but I also made sure to keep a clear separation between the gums and the lips, which looked quite cool in the end. After that, I continued work on the face and used a couple of blobs of green stuff to start shaping in the cheekbones and the eye sockets. I had to do a lot of back and forth in this area because I was struggling to get it looking like the original miniature, which is no surprise since I have the sculpting skills of a one-handed goose, but after adding a little skeletal nose and a bunch more squishing and prodding, I was able to get it looking decent enough that I could move on and cling to a rapidly diminishing hope that I'd be able to get it looking better with a second layer. For the remaining areas on the body, I basically just stretch out the green stuff into a thin sheet and then drape this down over the different sections using my sculpting tools to smooth everything over and build up some basic shapes like the musculature in the upper back and the little grooves for the ribs. I wasn't worrying too much about being perfect with this layer. The plan was just to make sure everything was covered and then build up the details properly using my second helping of green stuff. But even still, this stage did end up frustrating me a bit, as there would be a bunch of times where a piece of fresh green stuff wouldn't adhere properly to an area that had already started to cure, or where I just wasn't able to fully smooth over a blemish on the surface. I can't really blame green stuff for this though, as I don't think it's really intended for making large miniatures fully from scratch. There's probably a type of clay or polymer clay that would have worked better for this, but yeah, I was struggling to get it looking as smooth as I saw it in my mind, and that was frustrating for me, but all part of the learning process, I suppose. A bit of sanding once the green stuff had cured did help to mitigate some of my problems, but yeah, going into my second layer of the green stuff, I was definitely starting to lose some of that confidence I had prior to this. I got to work on my second layer of green stuff application by focusing on the back of our ghoulie boy. Since the first coat had now fully hardened, insert penis joke here, building up the details was a fair bit easier. This section ended up being quite enjoyable actually, as adding the actual details and bits of muscle definition really made everything feel like it was coming to life and was an actual miniature instead of just a little green blob man. His back did end up looking a lot more swole than the original miniature, and when I started building up the shoulders, which was probably the most enjoyable part overall, I ended up going a little bit off the rails with the proportions. He had some proper boulder shoulders by the time I finished, which are quite different from the little pipsqueak shoulders the Forge World version has, but yeah, I was just having a lot of fun here, building up the musculature and giving him my own personal touch. To me, this ghoul is way more scary if he's running at you on two hands with some thick old cannonball shoulders to support him, like he's some kind of mutant ghost pitbull hybrid. So yeah, this felt like a good decision at the time. I did try to keep the arms looking quite long and sinewy though, as I think some Arnie style biceps combined with the shoulders I'd just done would have looked a bit out of place, so I made sure to keep those a bit more on the withered looking side. It was at this point though that I started having some difficulties with the green stuff again, you know. I'd be trying to smooth over muscle inserts on the arms and I'd have them looking pretty good, then accidentally make a big groove or notch in them, which was then super difficult to smooth back out properly. And don't even get me started on the amount of times I had to re-smooth and retexture areas that I'd accidentally left a big old dirty fingerprint in. I must have wasted hours doing that in the end, and to be fair, it's my own fault. I should have just not held it by the curing green stuff. Anyway, once I had the larger areas looking as good as I could, I stuck a couple of ears onto his bonds, which looked pretty huge, but your ears never stop growing, and this guy is probably pretty old, so it makes sense kind of lore-wise, I suppose. I don't know what I'm saying. And then I used a bit more green stuff to add some little ragged scraps at the bottom of the torso, which I'm not sure if these are supposed to be scraps of clothing or innards, but we'll find out when I do the painting. After another bit of sanding to get those rougher spots under control, our miniature was looking pretty decent. I had an image in my head of how I wanted this to look before I started this project, but after doing my first couple of layers and realizing the limitations of my sculpting skills combined with the difficulty I was having with the green stuff, I was feeling fairly happy with this, all things considered. That meant it was time to do the finishing touches and start pulling everything together, so I got to work on adding those teeth first. For this, I snipped down the wire roots, mixed up some green stuff, rolled it out into little snakes, stuck little sections of it onto the wire, and sculpted them into jagged teeth shapes. This was a little bit fiddly and annoying, but still a lot easier than trying to attach them without the wire, and it looked pretty good in the end. Next up, I added some little bumps down the back of his spine, and the official miniature has some actual bony spine segments poking out the skin, but after realizing I would have no chance of making this actually look good, I settled for some under the surface spiny flesh bumps instead. I also started working on some hair tufts like the Forge World version, but again, I quickly realized it was going to look quite shit and would have obscured some of the details I was actually happy with, like the ears, so our ghoul boy is just going to stay bald for now. Finally, I just went around and tidied up any areas that needed it, for example, adding a bit more of a prominent texture to the ribs poking out here and smoothing over spots that weren't blended together very well. It was clear to me at this point that I'd never get rid of every single imperfection like I'd hoped before starting this, but I did my best to get rid of as many visible ones as possible. After a bit of my homemade mud mixture getting chucked onto the base, our actual building work was now fully completed, and all things considered, I think we're looking pretty good. There's a bunch of things I wish I could have done better, which I'll talk about at the end of the video, but for now, I'm going to see if I can cover up some of those shortcomings with a splash of paint. Now, the painting process for this bad boy was surprisingly easy. I wanted to go for a kind of spectrally blue colour, so I overbrushed some Thousand Suns blue onto the miniature as the base coat. Then I built up some coloured variation and some really quick and dirty highlights by dry brushing on progressively lighter coats. The first coat was a mixture of Thousand Suns blue with Cyberite green, and I applied this to maybe 80% of the previous layer. Next, I did another dry brush with Cyberite green on its own this time, again hitting 80% of the previous layer, which was 80% of the first layer, meaning this Cyberite green colour is applied to 64% of the total surface area, I think. Not really important though. Anyway, I did one last dry brushing with a mixture of Cyan Green and Baharoff Blue to give the brightest highlight layer, and then used this mixture to go around and add some more deliberately placed highlights. Once I had enough of that, I spent a little while using different mixtures of the previous colours to try and blend everything together a bit better and smooth out those harsher transitions from the dry brushing. I used some Baharoff Blue to give the skin a final highlight, and honestly I was really happy with how it was looking. It looks a bit more subtle on camera, but I love the mixture of the blues and kind of spectrally greeny blue colours mixed in, so feel free to call me Vincent Van Swamp Rat from now on. Moving on to the rest of the miniature, I mixed together some glistening blood and Rhinox hide to get a kind of glossy dried blood colour, and painted this into the mouth, nostrils, eye sockets, between the ribs, and on the little ragged bits at the bottom here too. I painted the teeth in quickly with some screaming skull, and then used some of the glistening blood on its own to add a little bit of gore in the mouth and also down on the ribs and bottom areas again. The claws got painted in with some Eshin grey and more of that glistening blood because why not, and then I just finished the whole thing off by dry brushing some muddy browns onto the base, painting in the horse, sloshing around a bit more blood, surprise surprise, adding a bit of flock for fun, and giving him the customary rim job with some Abaddon black. Let's see how it all turned out. So, what do you think, my friends? Pretty good or pretty shit? I think from a distance this miniature actually looks really cool, and I was really proud of the face and mouth especially. I feel like they're definitely the best looking parts of the miniature, and the hands actually surprisingly don't look anywhere near as bad as I thought they would, as they were a nightmare to sculpt. You don't need to get too close to start seeing the faults though. There's a bunch of areas where my sculpting looks really shoddy, or where there's a visible blemish in the surface of the green stuff, but yeah, all in all I think this is at least recognisable as the miniature I was trying to make in the first place. There are some very noticeable differences between the two though, of course, like mine is quite a lot bulkier in some sections, and I had to skip some details like the hair and the spine segments poking out, but considering this is my first attempt at scratch building an organic or kind of humanoid miniature, I'd say this has gone decently, and I've learned a lot of lessons I can incorporate into my next attempt. I'm going to look for some different sculpting mediums for next time too, as the green stuff did prove a bit trickier to work with than I'd hoped. Part of that is definitely due to my completely amateur sculpting skill, not even amateur to be honest, but yeah, there were a lot of times where it just wasn't behaving how I wanted it to, so if you have any suggestions for alternatives, let me know down below. As always though, if you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe or leave a like or a comment to let me know how I can improve my sculpting skills, or just to let me know whether you'd rather be a moth or a stag beetle. You already know I'd rather be a moth because moths are cool. Anyway, next video will be the return of the Swamp Hero Guard, which I am pumped for because it's been a little while. And for now, I have been your friendly neighborhood swamp rat, and I will see you very soon in another video. See ya.